Showing Part 2. Show the readers everything. Tell them nothing. Hemingway's advice isn't quite right for creative nonfiction. There are those times when we want to reflect deeply on an experience or reveal an epiphany or invite the reader into your thoughts. But he does make a really good point. I don't think I've ever written in a student text, tell, don't show, but I seem to write a lot, show me more, or show me this, or what does this look like, or I'd like to hear this character's voice. So as you're going through the process of drafting your piece, think about how you can bring the scenes to life for your reader. If you write your rough draft and there's a lot of telling, that's okay, perfectly fine. That's often how we write rough drafts. But as you go through the drafts, bring those details out, bring out those senses so that your reader can imagine the scenes that you're showing them. We'll be looking at E.B. White's Once More to the Lake later this term. I'm going to show you a couple of examples from that text. I felt the same damp moss covering the worms in the bait can and saw the dragonfly alight on the tip of my rod as it hovered a few inches from the surface of the water. So this is a great example of showing. We see the scene as the narrator imagines it or reimagines it in his mind. Now here's an example of telling. Suddenly, it would be not I, but my father who was saying the words or making the gesture. It gave me a creepy sensation. So in this passage, he's telling you what he thinks about this feeling that he has. So he's letting you into his mind. He's saying, this gave me a creepy sensation. But the vast majority of this particular essay is very much showing. And then he gives you this little bit of insight into what he's thinking right there. So how do you know when to show and when to tell? Well, most of the time, if you're wondering, then you should probably be showing. But it does depend. I mean, we don't want to show every single thing. Some portions of a scene are irrelevant. We don't necessarily need to see the main character walking from one room to the next. We just need them to get there, maybe. Judgment is key, and judgment comes from practice and from reading well and reading broadly. Jenna Butler says, read well and read broadly. And I really echo this. That is where your craft is going to come from, reading and writing. Here are some tips to help you out. One of the things I mentioned to my students is trust your reader. Give them enough information so that they can draw the right conclusions, but don't tell them what to think. Have them come to the conclusions that you want them to come to on their own. We do that by choosing the details that we want to share. And I know that there's always a tendency to want to wrap something up really clearly at the end. But again, if you've given your reader enough information, trust that they will figure it out. You don't necessarily need to spoon feed them to let them know what they need to think. Avoid information dumps. Sometimes we do a lot of really great research and we just want to tell our reader everything, or we feel like, well, we really need to give more information, background information for this character, and so I've got to give all this information. Really be deliberate in what you choose to share. We don't necessarily need to know that there's a sink in the kitchen if the action takes place in the backyard. Avoid meaningless words like beautiful, nice, and happy, unless, of course, that is exactly the right word. Avoid ly adverbs. This is a good thing to go through your writing before you submit and circle all the ly adverbs. Unless they are surprising or rhythmic or serve some other purpose, get rid of them. The problem with ly adverbs is that they are often just too easy, so they're overused. They are telling words. So if I say he sang loudly, I'm not letting you hear him sing. I am telling you that he sang loudly. If I say, the cat moved quietly, I'm not showing you how the cat moved. I am telling you that the cat moved quietly. Here's some examples. He walked quickly, or maybe he power walked. Sometimes you'll hear this quotation: verbs show, adverbs tell. Do you see what I did in this example? Instead of saying walked quickly, I said he power walked. Now we know, and we even have an image in our heads of what that looks like. She sang beautifully, or when she sang, the birds listened. This is a use of imagery. He was lonely after she left, or she had tricked him. She had made him leave his old self behind and come into her world. And then, before he was really at home in it, but too late to go back, she had left him stranded there, like an astronaut wandering about on the moon, alone. So this is a use of metaphor. Avoid summarizations. Leave summarizations to the synopsis. You don't want to summarize for the most part. I mean, sometimes we have to say this happened in the past or something, and we don't necessarily want to give a lot of description, but generally speaking, summarization is a bad idea because it pulls your reader right out of the story. I don't want to listen to a summarization of something. It's just not appealing. I want to be in that story. Don't repeat yourself. Are you telling your reader something you've already shown them? So this is a really common mistake that I see. A writer will describe a scene, they will show me the scene, and then they'll tell me what they just showed me. And I think that this is a little, kind of a little tick that you just have to get out of the habit of doing. So watch that you don't do that. When you use exposition or telling, make sure it is helping to make meaning and or pushing the story forward. When you reveal or reflect, make it artful. Personally, I think it's a lot harder to tell in a way that's evocative and interesting than it is to show. Now, I have had writers that have found the reverse, but generally that's a rule of thumb. It's also important to understand that we don't want to simply go from scene to scene. For example, it isn't always important to show your reader how a character gets from point A to point B. If something feels skimmable to you when you're writing it, the reader will skim too. Exposition can take us quickly from one scene to the next. Sometimes a white space can do this job as well. Let's look at a couple of examples from Elizabeth Withy's story, Soft in the Middle. Here's an example of showing. Popcorn, our Shih Tzu, panted nervously at my feet, his thin tongue dangling over his bottom teeth. Boy, I can just picture that in my mind. Telling, the Fergusons were going on a road trip. So this final sentence serves to wrap up the paragraph and move us into the next scene. In other words, it moves the story forward. It acts like a transition. It also gives us a little bit more information. We now have a name for the family, and it's confirmed in our minds that they are going on a road trip. Even the term road trip is important because even though this statement primarily tells, that particular word shows. We've all been there on a road trip, or I should say most of us have been, as a child or as a guest or as a parent. We all have in our own memories of road trips that subconsciously we are superimposing on the scene. So this term does double duty. It tells us what's happening and it places us within the story. No way, coffee's gross, I retorted. The opening sentence of this paragraph is really strong. We can almost hear the character spitting out the words, and we're drawn further into the scene. It's also wonderfully childlike, so it helps to characterize. This really shows. This shows the voice of the character, and we can hear that character. Here's an example of telling. Mom and Dad drank it nonstop on the road. The smell of it made me puke. But car travel was all injustice, double standards. Like, why did we have to be buckled in before the car started moving when Dad didn't? My father only wore his seatbelt sometimes. Often he'd just hang it over his shoulder to fool the cops into thinking he was strapped in. Okay, so by the time we encounter this exposition, Withy has already placed us in the scene, and she's already created strong characters, so we're there with her. In this paragraph, she builds on what she's already created, but now in a reflective voice. You'll notice that she moves from the voice of innocence to the voice of experience seamlessly. The use of the word puke is strong, but it's expected because we're prepared for that kiddish kind of diction by the scene that preceded it. The exposition that follows paints a picture of a complex power dynamic within the family. We know that there's kind of an issue here. We're starting to see the cracks in the family dynamics. We begin to see that the father has his set of rules and everyone else has another. We also begin to see the main character's resentment of this dynamic. This exposition is artfully written and it's illuminating at the same time. It has a good sense of rhythm, so it skips along and leads us forward. It doesn't slump. There's no incidental language here. Every word of this is important. In fact, it leaves us with more questions than it answers. In this way, it pulls us into the next scene. We gain momentum, we don't lose it. When you're trying to decide whether to show or tell, think about purpose. Most of the time, you'll want to show, but when you decide to tell, be very clear in your own mind why you've made that decision. How does it serve meaning and purpose? How does it pull the reader forward?